găsit! Invitatul meu de astăzi este domnul Rüdiger von Fritsch, un exponent al elitei diplomației germane. A lucrat în diplomație, dar a ocupat și postul de vicepreședinte al Serviciului Federal de Informații, BND. În 2010 a preluat funcția de ambasador al Germaniei în Polonia, iar din 2014 până în 2019 a fost ambasador al Republicii Federale Germania în Federația Rusă. Un motiv pentru care este aici este apariția acestei cărți, un punct de cotitură, apărută la editura Curtea Veche, și le mulțumim colegilor de la editură pentru că au facilitat acest interviu. Hello. Thank you for accepting this invitation.
Well, hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to Romania TV. It's my pleasure to be here.
We have a war next to us for 8 months already. You said that this war is not only a war against Ukraine, but also a war against the West. Well, this thesis is rejected by some in Romania also. They say that this is a war that is in the East, it's their war and should not concern us. What are your arguments?
My arguments are what Vladimir Putin himself said. And this makes clear that it is not only about trying to annex part of Ukrainian territory, to link up Crimea to Russia. It is also about subjugating Ukraine altogether, to make it dependent on Russia. But beyond that, in December last year, he made very clear in demands put to us what it is ultimately all about. And he put ultimate demands to us. He said, before starting the war, that we have to thin out our military forces on our east and southeastern flanks, withdrawing NATO troops, for example, also from Romania. He said NATO shall not expand, and it was not only about Ukraine, it was also about Sweden and Finland. And he thirdly said that the American nuclear umbrella, which has been shielding and protecting all of Europe altogether, has to be withdrawn. So he wants to influence us, he wants to weaken us in order to higher the Russian position, strengthen the Russian position. And why did he do so? Because Russia is constantly weakening. It is a giant on clay feet. It is not as strong as it sometimes seems, particularly if you take Russia's economy. The economic model of Russia, which Vladimir Putin has been unable and I think unwilling to reform, is dependent constantly on the export of oil and gas. And this is not a model for the future. And as Russia is weakening, not only in comparison to us, but also to China, he took his ultimate weapon and he banged the table, trying to change the order so that Russia's position will be strengthened in a world, as he sees it, which is a world of the 19th century, where the great powers decide where the smaller ones sort of fall off the sofa to the right and the left. And this is what we cannot accept, and this is why we have to stand together as partners and allies in order to defend our freedom. Yes, prices of energy are rising, but freedom is priceless.
So when you are weak, you have to make the other one weaker too. This
exactly.
is an old say, yeah.
Absolutely, that's exactly what he's trying to do. Weaken us because he is weak and trying to increase his influence on us.
In the first chapter of this book, you are talking about 4 possible scenarios. The victory of Ukraine, the victory of Russia, a draw, and the escalation of conflict. Now, this book was finished in April this year. Now, after Ukraine's successful September offensive in Kharkov, after the annexation by Russia of some new territories, 4, and after Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons, have your scenarios changed?
I would add maybe a 5th one. But the 4 ones still are valid. As the war is going so bad, Vladimir Putin all the more is trying to force through a Russian victory. As Ukraine has been successful, though for a time given, of course Ukraine is fighting for a victory. And as the war is going badly, Vladimir Putin has used the means of escalation already. We have seen it with cutting exports of energy, and now again these days cutting export of grain, trying to start a sort of a hunger war on the world, trying to use cyber influence in our countries, and escalated the war militarily, sort of indiscriminately in Ukraine against civilian targets. So he has escalated And the fifth scenario I would want to add is that the war could change through a change of power in Russia. This cannot be excluded as the war has gone so badly because he himself has decided it. He alone, because he is not controlled, he is not well consulted by anybody, he cannot exclude any longer that he will be criticized back home and somebody will decide to change power in Russia. That would be a fifth scenario. To return to the fourth scenario, the draw. This, of course, always is not to be excluded. Historically, we see that wars end in a ceasefire and then negotiations. But in a ceasefire, what matters is the question who holds the biggest stick. And this is why Ukraine insists on conditions before they go into negotiations. This is why they insist on a Russian withdrawal, because Ukraine could not accept a ceasefire in which Russia would immediately threaten, if you don't sign on the dotted line our conditions, we will restart the war. This is unacceptable for Ukraine and I think for everybody. Therefore, a draw is not to be excluded, but it must be a draw on eye level. You can decide, as Volodymyr Zelensky proposed very early on, let's have a ceasefire and let's agree to disagree on sort of territorial issues and then start a negotiation process. This diplomatically is always possible, but Russia is rejecting it. Russia basically in substance is rejecting negotiations other than to its conditions, which is subjugate Ukraine, etc. And this also explains why any sort of mediation has become so difficult. As Russia is so insistent, they don't accept mediation. So many have tried. Turkey has tried, Israel has tried, the UN Secretary General has tried and has come back empty-handed. Hungary also tried. And the country that most likely would be in a position to reach a mediation is standing on the sideline, which is China. This war is not in China's interest, but even China is not in a position to influence Vladimir Putin to end this war. And this shows sort of his resolve. And as he is fighting for his political survival in Ukraine these days, he is not ready to accept mediation or a negotiated settlement. This is what makes it so difficult.
You said that China is the winner in this war, and we will come back to, to your quote. But
it's not really a winner, but we will come back to that.
Yeah. Some sources in the Ukrainian diplomacy told me that a ceasefire is acceptable for Ukraine, but not negotiate with Putin. As long as Putin is in power, there will be no negotiation between the two sides.
This is a position one can take. On the other hand, diplomacy and politics are reality. We have to deal with given realities. We cannot exclude that Vladimir Putin will stay in power for some more time. And therefore, we have to deal with given realities. Yes, it would be sort of for many good to close the eyes and Russia has gone away and Vladimir Putin has gone away. But if he's still there and there would be a chance for a just peace, that is what it is about. They are not just wars, justified wars, but they are just, can be a just peace. And if that position would be there, I think it would be necessary to negotiate it with Russia as it is given.
But can you negotiate with a man who will be charged with as a criminal war, with a man who lies every day? As a diplomat, can you do that?
As a diplomat, you have to be ready to talk to everybody if it is about maintaining or reaching the peace. If you can reach a just peace, a just understanding, you unfortunately have to talk to sometimes very strange opponents. You have to talk to people who are authoritarian, who are dictators, and you have to accept a given situation. If you wouldn't do that, you would rather sort of be in a situation where we might be risking continuing a conflict as we see it.
Now, if Russia is using his nuclear weapons, the United States said that this is a red line, and there will be consequences.
Yes.
What consequences could be?
This is the ultimate red line. This is correct. And my impression is that Vladimir Putin is very well aware of that. Because while he is, on the one side, constantly sort of threatening that he might use ultimate weapons, it is in part to make us afraid. And we must not fall into the trap of fear Vladimir Putin is building up for us. And we must look at probabilities and at facts again. So what are the facts? The facts are the Russian nuclear doctrine, which is well known. You can read it. And there was one stipulation in this nuclear doctrine that Russia may use nuclear weapons in order to end a war to its own favor. So this is carte blanche.
But if there is an aggression against Russia,
also,
especially.
But even sort of below this, he can use it if it is in order to end a war in Russia's favor. This is carte blanche, and this is something he could have done since February. When the war went badly for him in February and March, he could have used this to escalate, to end the war in Russia's favor, according to the Russian nuclear doctrine. He has not done so. He has threatened again now, whilst at the same time building up his conventional forces, mobilizing hundreds of thousands, or trying to mobilize hundreds of thousands in Russia, of soldiers, putting in more military hardware, more conventional aggression against Ukraine. So this makes it rather probable that he's trying to end this war in his favor on a conventional way, because he knows that if he would resort to these ultimate tools he has, it would be devastating for Russia, for his power. And my hope also is that if China is not in a position to end this war, that Xi Jinping at least has told Vladimir Putin, dear friend, do not cross this red line. Do not violate this ultimate taboo. It will be devastating for all of us.
And what will happen if he crossed the red line? Who will act? United Nations, NATO, EU, only United States? What will happen?
This is a very hypothetical question.
Yes, of course.
But my understanding is that the Western alliance, that particularly the United States, are well prepared for such a situation and have signaled to Vladimir Putin on the channel still existing what would be the consequences, and that this is why he is sort of holding back from this.
Could NATO set a no-flying zone over Ukraine? What do you think?
We have discussed this early on in the conflict, no-fly zone. A no-fly zone is difficult for a specific reason. If you want to enforce a no-fly zone, you must protect your own air force. And where is it threatened from? Not from inside Ukraine, from inside Russia. So if you want to protect your air force, you have to make sure that they are not being sort of shot at from inside Russia. And this would make it a war carried by those air force, by NATO air force, inside Russia. And this would be a confrontation with Russia directly. This is why a no-fly zone has not been enforced.
Now, when it speaks of Russia, the West speaks about Putin. When it speaks of Russia's war, the West speaks of Putin's war. You knew him, you had many opportunities to discuss with him, and you said that it would be a mistake to think that Putin is irrational. He just thinks different than us. But let me read some of his words that you quote. He always distributes everything into mental categories established according to enemies, conspirators, and threats. Another one. Putin no longer perceives reality except to the extent in which it falls on the world that he himself imagines. Now, someone could see here signs of paranoia or schizophrenia.
Well, it's a different world of logic. He thinks according to a different rationale. But within his own rationale, he is, according to his own logic, he's a rational politician. But we have to understand what his rationality is in order to know whom we are dealing with. And this is the rationality of a Soviet-trained KGB officer who thinks in a world of conspiracies, who is always afraid that somebody threatening him. Look at the reality. NATO troops are only standing inside NATO member states, while Russian troops are standing inside 3 independent countries, in Georgia, in Moldova, and Transnistria and in Ukraine. So it's not that anybody is aggressing Russia, but that's how he perceived the world, because he has been trained to think in this conspiracy. This is why he's so repressive inside his country, because he's so afraid that there might be a popular an unrest against him, which could only be organized by the West, according to him. Every sort of independent revolt of people he has always perceived as being instigated by somebody else, be it the Arab Revolution, be it the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution. He cannot imagine that people sort of reach a point of dissatisfaction that they're out of their own will revolt. And this creates a blind spot in the perception of dictators. And this makes the situation dangerous for him, because that's something that could perhaps even happen in Russia.
Well, is the old question, no? Who is to blame? Who is the guilty person? No? Kto vinovat?
Kto vinovat? Kto vinovat is the most important question of the Russian language, next to что делать? What should be done? We are in a situation where we are dealing with somebody who was authoritarian, who now is a dictator. And what is the nature of a dictator? He is not being controlled by anybody. In the old communist days, you at least had a Politburo. And the Politburo would get rid of Nikita Khrushchev and change him. There is no Politburo. Everybody around him is equally afraid of him as the entire country is. And that leads to a situation where he is not even being well advised. He has no independent advice. And this brought him into a situation where he perceived reality completely false.
Do you think no one is giving him advice? Not even Patrushev?
Well,
say, or
somebody like Nikolai Patrushev would sort of even give him worse advice and try to push him even further, maybe. But independent, critical advice that would have told him, look, the Ukrainian army is not as weak as you think. Look, our army is not as strong as you think. Look, the reality of Ukraine is different than you think. They are not waiting for you to be liberated. They're an independent country striving for democracy and Western values. Look, the West is going to react as the West had announced. Nobody dared to say him, and so he ran into this terrible adventure, which has brought so much damage to his own interests. Look only at his demands he had. NATO should not be expanded. What was the consequence of his aggression? Sweden and Finland immediately asked for membership. He is ruining his own country's economy. He's ruining his country's future. Sort of everything he did was inflicting damage on Russia. And this is something we had not imagined possible, that he could do something that would be so self-damaging to Russia.
Now, Putin is the chief, the dictatorship.
Yes.
It's a chain of command from the top to the bottom.
Vertical,
we saw
yes.
4 or 5 days before the war how these important guys, these important Siloviki, were humiliated in front of the camera.
Yes.
But there are still people that somehow opposing him and criticize his war in Ukraine, like Prigozhin or Kadyrov, for instance.
Yes.
Is this theater or it's for real? What do you think?
It's not theater. This is for real. They're not criticizing Vladimir Putin. They're criticizing the Russian army leadership. But of course, everybody knows that sort of beyond the Russian army leadership stands Vladimir Putin. So this situation has become critical for him because he's dependent on these aggressive actors. He's dependent on Chechens fighting so ruthlessly in Ukraine, on Prigozhin's mercenaries fighting his war. And this partly explains why he escalated conventionally. He sort of made a sort of gift to them. He says, yes, I follow your advice. I put in more soldiers. I put in more military hardware. He must watch that right-wing side too. But in the end, it is him deciding everything. The guilt is on him. But let me add this. Of course, immense guilt is being heaped on the Russian people. In the future, this war will remain with the Russian people. I do understand the reasons why the Russians, in sort of face of their history and of what they have gone through, do not everyone bravely take to the streets, as we have seen, that they only start to protest when Vladimir Putin breaks the social contract, which is we rule, you leave us alone, and we look after you, and we don't touch your private lives. He has started to do this, and this is the point where people started to react. But it's not a protest against the war. So in the longer run, and this is what I get as feedback from Russians I know, they say what immense guilt is our people heaping on us, and will the Ukrainians ever forgive us?
Now, Germany has a special relationship with Russia for centuries. And also in diplomacy, you are one of the few that at the end of the term met President Putin. And this is something.
Yes.
So you met him a lot of times. There were any moments when you were shocked or something is revealing to you about Putin and about his policy?
Yes, it was revealing to meet him. As an ambassador, you do not meet a president one-on-one frequently, though I did also. Mostly I assisted in meetings, let's say, of Chancellor Merkel or Foreign Ministers Steinmeier, Gabriel Mas, when they were meeting Putin. And this was very revealing, because his approach was also a classic KGB approach. Tried to be soft-spoken, friendly. It was a bit good cop, bad cop, you know. Lavrov bashing, and then you saw Putin, and he tried to say, we are understanding, and haven't we had good relations? And he tried to lull his opponent, and all of a sudden he came with his dagger and punched. And you always had the impression that underneath a somehow controlled surface, there is an immense aggression. And his personal aggressivity explained this war too, because what he considers to be the trauma of his country, the fall of the old Russian Empire in 1992, was not only the Soviet Union, but this huge colonial empire which fell apart. The trauma of his country very much is his own trauma. And the big mistake, which is a mistake sort of easily made in history, is not having dealt properly with your own country's history. If you only think you have been a victim of something, and if the guilt is always with somebody else, then we are in for conflict. You have to look properly at your history, and Russia should, and there were efforts like with Memorial, famous civic society organizations, to look properly at the history.
Who was closed.
Which was closed tellingly by Vladimir Putin, which was founded in the late Soviet Union. And if you do not look at what were Russia's faults and mistakes and what is Russia's guilt, and that a trauma like Russia has, Estonians can have, Romanians can have, as a result of Soviet occupation and aggression. And if you only think, well, I am a victim and you have to deal with my trauma, then we're in a situation like we're in right now. And this is what is about Vladimir Putin's overall perception. He has a specific outlook on global politics, conspiracies everywhere. He is guided by what I would call a grand Russian imperialist ambition, which has grown over the years with him, and you can read it in his essays on history. And thirdly, he is guided by having been a Soviet KGB officer. And these three positions and attitudes lead us into a situation in which we're in right now.
Now, you said that as a diplomat you have to talk to anyone, to Putin, to Bashar al-Assad, whatever. And I quote again from your book, speaking about Russian diplomats. It is a characteristic of Russian policy to deal with the truth that is convenient, not what is real. Another one, Russian diplomats are prisoners of a system of dependence, obedience, and terror. Who smiles without a reason is weak. This is the fundamental conviction of Russian politics. For Putin, legitimacy is more important than legality. So, is diplomacy possible with the Russians? I mean, these guys doesn't respect their own signature on the treaties. They don't remember what they are saying about some things. If they don't speak the truth and they don't have good faith, how can you trust them in diplomacy?
Well, to trust is very difficult indeed, but to know is important. To know the way they think, to know the way they argue. And if you know their mindset, and if you know how they have been trained to always heap the blame on you, and you are guilty. And I sometimes felt, when discussing the annexation of Crimea after 2014 in Moscow, as we had annexed Crimea, you know, this kind of aggressive argumentation. But if you know this, you can also deal with this. Again, because you have to deal with given realities. My Russian counterparts were very well-trained diplomats, but they were trained in a different mindset. If you know this mindset, you can deal with it, and you can try to reach agreements. And this is what is important about the current situation, that we have to realize that Vladimir Putin has thrown over the chessboard. He has put a final end to a world which we had before, together with the Soviet Union and Russia. Let's not forget that even in the 1970s, in a confrontative situation of Cold War, we could reach agreements with the Soviet Union on arms control, on disarmament. We established the CSCE, Helsinki Accord, and this continued also with Russia. Having a different mindset, being a different world, the Russians, you nevertheless can reach agreements. And this held true until now. Even after the first aggression, Russia was ready to sign the Minsk Accord, which was a diplomatic solution, as good or bad as it is, under ongoing fire, as it was in 2015, but you nevertheless could reach a diplomatic agreement. This he has finally ended. He has said, I don't want dialogue any longer. That's the situation we're in, and he has put us into a new world of confrontation. This is what we have to deal with. And this is what is the most important characteristic about our time. We're in a world of confrontation. And this has consequences. First, we have to put order to confrontation again, as we did in the 70s. After this war, think of how we can make it stable and predictable and safe, and reach agreements on inspections, verifications, arms control, etc. This is a minimum. And make sure that those countries, Vladimir Putin wants to leave in the mud of history in between us, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, etc., are not left there, but that they too, in the longer perspective, have a clear perspective for being part of the Western community if they want to.
Now, Germany is seen by some as too close to Russia, by some. Angela Merkel is seen by too empathetic with Putin. She endorsed the Minsk I and II agreements, actually a Russian trap, in fact, as like Transnistrian agreement also. The war seems for Germany far away after Crimea annexation, for some, and trade was more important. What would you answer to these guys?
I'm quite aware that you can perceive German politics and German efforts to try to resolve this conflict this way. But again, we were in a different world then. A world in where negotiated settlements were possible. And the Minsk Accords were upon the very strong demand of the Ukrainian president then. We must not forget that Russian forces continued to advance into Ukraine, that the Ukrainian armed forces were much weaker than they are now. And in 2014-15, being in Moscow with my colleagues from other European countries, we were never sure how far is Russia going to go. Is Kiev going to be a Ukrainian city still by the day after tomorrow? And this was a situation in where a negotiation was sort of demanded by President Poroshenko, but not only him, and it reached a settlement where at least the worst of war stopped, and a settlement with which also in the end the Russians were not so happy. Because they thought all diplomatic settlements are not in our favor, let's start the war again. And the approach taken by Germany in the years thereafter was the same approach taken by everybody in the West. And let me give you one example. In summer 2021, half a year before the war started, President Joe Biden met with President Vladimir Putin in Geneva. And he took the same approach Western politics had taken continuously, which was stand tall with resolve, react to aggression with clear messages, with sanctions, etc., whilst at the same time try to reach agreement in negotiation, try to look, and this is what President Biden said in those days, to identify issues which are in common interest where we have to talk about be it climate change, migration, terror, pandemia, etc. So this dual approach always was taken, and there sort of Germany was in a similar position to everybody else. And Angela Merkel, whom I have accompanied variously, meeting with Vladimir Putin, always had a very clear perspective of where Russia was standing, where Vladimir Putin was standing, and she was sort of not mistaken about whom she was talking to.
You are a diplomat with studies in history and philology, and we know that Putin himself is obsessed with history, not only to make history, but also to rewrite history. And I like your quote from Lev Gudkov, from Levada Center: "The Russians are no longer believing in the future, but in the past."
Yes.
So we know that Putin is obsessed with history. He admires Alexander III and Peter the Great. He himself rehabilitated Stalin. He wants to create the imperial Russia, the last colonial empire in the world. Do you think that this is still possible in this century to recreate the Russian empire? I mean, Putin himself believes that, but what the Russian believes, the Russian you met in the 5 years in Russian Federation, how they deal with the history and with the messianic role of Russia?
Yes. Well, first it is very telling that a leader talks so much about the past, tries to tell his people, weren't we a great and important country, and didn't we have a huge role, and shouldn't we have it again? If you only talk about the past, you have no future to offer. There is no bright future Vladimir Putin is offering his country. People deep down know that the country is slowly declining. There is not even sort of the bright sun of communism somewhere out there, which was offered by communist ideology in Soviet times. So it is very retrospective, it is very reactionary. And you try to tell your people, and the propaganda is omnipresent in Russia, you try to tell the people, weren't we a great country? Shouldn't we be there again? And somehow people do endorse this, because of course they are very much in love of their own history, if you tell it that way. And he particularly emphasizes the role of Soviet Union in the end of World War II, because this is where all peoples and people of the Soviet Union stood together and were victorious.
Homo Sovieticus?
Homo Sovieticus sort of also was created through this. And as Russia, or the Soviet Union, was so successful then, and it was about a fight against fascism, he has to tell his people, in order to get their support, which is dwindling, the support is dwindling, he has to tell them, we are fighting the fascists again, notwithstanding the fact that the president of Ukraine is of Jewish origin. This strange sort of narrative is coming out of this, and he's trying to bind his people with the past. Can he return to this? We must make sure that this is not possible, that the times of the 19th century, where the great powers had every right to go wherever they were, that the sort of the right of the stronger one is what counts in international relations, that this is out and over. It has failed in 2 world wars, and after this we have built a world of equal states in the United Nations Charter, and particularly in the CSCE. And this is the world we are fighting for. We must maintain this equality of states, the independence and sovereignty of states, and we must defend, and this is what this war is about, our freedom, our democratic system, our free economic order, the prosperity of our people. And he wants to return us into the 19th century, and we do know how this has failed.
But maybe he succeed to do that, because, for instance, Germany passed through important shifts and changes. You are writing now your national security defense strategy. Now Germany is allowed to send weapons to conflict areas, and that was one of the most important pillars of your foreign policy, and also increased the budget of the defense
yes.
ministry. So do you think that weapons in the future will be the guarantee for prosperity and peace?
Our ability as a Western Union, as a transatlantic alliance, to protect ourselves, to live in peace for such a long period, has been dependent also on our ability to defend us and to send clear defensive signals. So this will matter in the future too. And what happened in Germany as a result of the war was also somehow something you could say was to the detriment of Russia's interest. Because 3 days after the war started, the Chancellor took the country around 180 degrees and says, we're in a different world now. We're in this world of confrontation and not of dialogue any longer. Therefore, we have to contribute to our national defense and to the ability to protect our partners. And we must finally end a policy which was guided by our own history. And this is what we did to the continent in the 20th century. And that was never export weapons to zone of conflicts. And the position changed to, if somebody is being aggressed upon so ruthlessly as Ukraine now is, then we have to stand on the side of the victim, and we have to try to assist the victim. If this is well done, and if this conflict can be ended well, we will not be in a world of an increased importance of defense spending and of arms and of confrontation. We can return to a world of equality of states, of negotiated agreements, also with Russia. Russia is not a country that is inept for different policies as Vladimir Putin is leading them. I had an interesting conversation one day with Mikhail Gorbachev, and he said to me, and I think this is very true, only the West believes Russia is unfit for democracy. Russia can be as democratic as anybody else. It would be a long process there, but we must never lose the confidence and the hope that one day Russia can change too. And not forget also that, yes, it's a country in aggression right now, but it is still a great country that has contributed a lot to European culture and to European history also positively, and that we must not lose the hope that one day we can build good relations in order to live together with conflicting interests also on this huge Eurasian landmass. Because after all, Russia continues to be a European country. If you go to Vladivostok, east of China, nobody wants to hear the Beijing opera. Everybody wants to hear Rachmaninoff and Beethoven, etc.
So in the last 2 minutes, we will skip China issue, unfortunately. I will quote one of your say from Giuseppe Tomasi de Lampedusa at the end. You like it because this is the quote on your conferences as partner in management consultancy Berlin Global Advisors. So, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change, said Lampedusa. Why do you like this saying?
Let me put it into concrete terms for these days. We want to maintain this order of sovereignty of states, of independence, of multilateralism. And if it is threatened, we must change our means. We must be ready to assist the country aggressed upon. We must change our approach. We must make sure that other countries get a perspective to join the West. So we take a different approach as in the past in order to maintain to what has proven to be so good and so much in the interest and for the well-being of our peoples.
Well, Ambassador von Fritsch, thank you so much for this
My
interview.
great pleasure being with you. Thank you.
Doamnelor și domnilor, a fost o plăcere să-l avem astăzi invitat pe excelența sa, ambasadorul Rüdiger von Fritsch. Vă reamintim, aceasta este cartea pe care o va lansa zilele acestea la București, un punct de cotitură, războiul lui Putin și urmările lui. Atât pentru astăzi. Cu bine!